who, like many of you, know a lot about the topic already and or knew Dr. Wilmore personally. So as I understand it, I have to go for about an hour and then we kind of discuss for about an hour. Is that the plan? Okay, so that's kind of.
Yeah, you've got some flexibility there.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm kind of going for. So, I provided a title for the talk that's about kind of the roots of Black theology. So I'll include that as a portion of the talk, but really a better title is just kind of the life and legacy of Garrod Wilmore, or at least some parts of that, because that's what I'm going to talk about. And I believe we're marking what would have been his 100th birthday. This was originally scheduled for last month, and I had to reschedule, which last month I believe would have been his 100th birthday. So, yeah, I could share a little about me first. I know a few of you already. I'm from Davidson, North Carolina. My name is Douglas Clark. Most of my family on both sides have been Presbyterian for generations, but in majority white churches. A couple of years before I was born, my parents joined a Black Presbyterian church in Davidson, North Carolina, Davidson Presbyterian Church, which is not the same as Davidson College Presbyterian Church. They're about 100 yards from each other, separated by the railroad tracks and Main Street. And some of you might be aware that that particular area of the country, the Charlotte, North Carolina area, has the largest concentration of Black Presbyterians in the country. So there's a lot of kind of vitality around that. My parents were kind of idealistic white Southern Presbyterians, both recent seminary graduates, and were trying to make a kind of anti-racist choice in terms of church membership. My mother's a hospital chaplain, and she preached from that church's pulpit many times, especially during an extended period when they were without a full-time pastor. My father served as a trustee for the church, and so I grew up in that church. And that's where I learned about Jesus and the Bible, and for my first kind of hymns, and went to Sunday school, Vacation Bible School, kind of my basics of Christian education. And probably of Reformed theology in some fashion, to the extent that you teach that to a little kid, right? My childhood pastor was Mark Lomax, a Black liberationist scholar who had been a student of Gayrod Wilmore's and is now pastor of First African Presbyterian in Lithonia, Georgia, and teaches at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta. So, and what also went over my head at the time when I was a kid is that a lot of my fellow church members were dealing with lots of things that my family didn't have to think about in our day-to-day lives, and redlining and mass incarceration, racial profiling, employment discrimination, school resegregation, and so on and so forth. But, so I became aware of some of that stuff later. But that's just kind of basically how I got into this work. I come from the church. My work is not just for kind of scholars and academics, it's for the church and kind of everyday people in the pews and people who are dealing with those same kind of challenges of living in a racist country in a lot of ways, as we see in the news frequently. I went on to study Black religious history as well as Black and womanist theologies in college, and then I went to Vanderbilt for graduate school to continue studying American religious history and African-American religious history. And I wrote my dissertation as a biography, or at least a partial kind of biography of Dr. Wilmore. And was especially blessed to have the opportunity to meet him and interview him several times and correspond with him during the last 3 or 4 years of his life, age 95 to 98 or something like that. And but I'm envious of those of you who got to spend a little more time with him in the flesh than I did. So I just got a glimpse. But so that's kind of how I got here and how I come to this topic. I'm not a Black Presbyterian, but Black Presbyterianism and a lot of the influences of Dr. Wilmore have been really formative for me as a person and as a Christian and as a scholar. So all credit due to those communities, but none of the blame, of course, for things that I miss, right? Yeah, so next thing I want to talk about is I'm going to tell the story about how Dr. Wilmore became Presbyterian. As with a lot of things tonight, I'm sure a lot of you already know this story and you may have seen it in print other places and things like that. But I think this is just a really neat story, so I'm going to tell it anyway. So Gayrod Wilmore, and many of y'all know him as Gay, right? I was very formal, like Dr. Wilmore. I just call him Dr. Wilmore, right? But Garrod Wilmore grew up in North Philadelphia in the 1920s and 30s in a low-income Black neighborhood during the Great Migration, when many African Americans were moving from the South to northern cities, a migration that led to a lot of white flight, which was white people moving out of those cities to the suburbs because they didn't want to live near Black people. And then when those white people left, one thing that happened sometimes was they vacated their old church buildings. Wilmore's father, who was actually Gayraud Wilmore Sr., Gay Wilmore was junior, though he didn't like to use that appendix there. Wilmore Sr. was a prominent community leader, a decorated veteran, a former member of a celebrated regiment known as the Harlem Hellfighters, who had fought in World War I, and every member of that regiment was awarded the Croix de Guerre for serving under French leadership in World War I. After the war, Wilmore Sr. founded the first Black American Legion post in Pennsylvania, which was Philadelphia's Crispus Attucks Post 151, named for that African-American martyr of the Boston Massacre, Crispus Attucks. And together with another community leader, Wilmore Sr. and a dentist named John K. Rice founded a community organization called the North Philadelphia Civic League in the 1920s and 30s. And one day, some white Presbyterian officials approached these two men and said, you can have this church building, has a 500-person capacity, a gym, a bowling alley, 15 classrooms, and so forth, because the congregation has all moved to the suburbs. There's just a few people left in this white Presbyterian church. The condition, though, is that you need to form a new Presbyterian church in that building, and also pick up the mortgage for that building, which was not insignificant. They agreed, though, and those families all became Presbyterian overnight. A lot of them had been Methodist and Baptist, but also they drew in some other Black Presbyterians from across the city. And the officers of the North Philadelphia Civic League all became elders, and they formed what was called McDowell Community Presbyterian Church. And Dr. Wilmore is referred to it sometimes as the North Philadelphia Civic League at its knees, right? To speak to the kind of connection between civic organization and community organizing and the church. Gayrod Wilmore the younger was about 15 years old at that time. So this might seem like kind of an odd, kind of idiosyncratic story, but the same thing actually happened elsewhere because of the Great Migration and white flight. Again, the same kind of dynamics. This is how St. Augustine Presbyterian in the Bronx was founded under Edler Hawkins, who would later become the first Black moderator of the Presbyterian Church. And it's also how the Church of the Master was founded in Harlem under James Robinson. Mm-hmm. So 3 major Black Presbyterian churches founded within 1 year of each other. This is 1937 and 38, all 3 of them in buildings vacated by white Presbyterian congregations in New York and Philadelphia. So that's how Dr. Wilmore became Presbyterian, the guy who eventually would write the book Black and Presbyterian and become one of the most influential Presbyterians of the past century, which I think is just such a neat kind of story. Right? If you were not a Presbyterian, you'd say, what a funny coincidence. It's providential, right? So he's Presbyterian, and so then one thing you do then is that you go to college, right? And if you're a Black Presbyterian in Philadelphia, then there's a good choice for you at the time. It's Lincoln University in rural Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania, historically Black Presbyterian university that had one of just 2 Black Presbyterian seminaries in the country at the time, along with Johnson C. Smith Seminary in Charlotte. And now there's no longer a seminary at Lincoln, but at the time it was one of 2. And so he went there for college and eventually for seminary as well. And while he was there in college, he got involved in the civil rights movement in the early 1940s, right? Now, when does the civil rights movement begin? We usually think of it as starting in the mid-50s, right? With kind of Brown versus Board and the Montgomery bus boycott. But civil rights historians will sometimes talk about a long civil rights movement and look at the earliest roots of the movement back in the 30s and 40s. And this is a part of that, something someone could point to for that. Lincoln University just outside the town of Oxford, Pennsylvania, which was a segregated town just 5 miles north of the Mason-Dixon line, southeastern PA. And these college students engaged in a decades-long sporadic campaign throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s that they called the Oxford Campaign, or Operation Oxford, especially because a lot of them wound up being military veterans, so they use this language of operation, right? To desegregate restaurants and movie theaters in this little nearby segregated town. The campaign began, at least in part, because of the passage of a Pennsylvania state law in 1939 banning racial discrimination in public accommodations. This law was mostly not enforced, but it became the mission of these Lincoln students for about the next 20 years to try to get it enforced, and they were eventually successful in doing that. The spark for that whole campaign, I think what really got things rolling in the first place among Lincoln students, was in the spring semester of 1942, just a few months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And that semester, several Lincoln undergraduates engaged in a kind of a revival of the local chapter, student chapter of the NAACP. Apparently they'd had a student chapter of the NAACP in the past, but it had sort of gone dormant, as happens with student organizations at colleges, you know, and so they got it restarted. And the inaugural president of this new chapter of NAACP was a guy named James Andrew Johnson, or Deke Johnson, is his nickname. And the vice president was a 20-year-old sophomore from Philadelphia named Garrod Wilmore, Jr. This organization's first public event, April 30th, 1942, consisted of 2 speeches, the first of which was by Garrod Wilmore on the history and the activities of the NAACP as a national organization, which had been around for just a couple of decades at that point, pretty new. But he gave the history of this. He was already doing civil rights history before there even kind of was a civil rights movement, right? And the second speech given was by another student about the poll tax and what a problem the poll tax was. So they started this chapter. And again, as with the founding of MacDowell Church, this was not that unique or unusual, because there was a larger trend at this time. NAACP membership was going through the roof nationally during World War II. It went up tenfold. So that's really, World War II era is really when the NAACP became a really big nationwide organization with lots and lots of members during that era. So they had this, this little student organization, right? And they were engaged in this sporadic campaign trying to stir up trouble in the neighboring town, right? The reason it was sporadic is largely because of the war. In early 1943, so about a year after they founded their organization, Garrod Wilmore and lots of his classmates were essentially drafted in the army. They were sort of in the reserves, expecting not to be called up, and they got called up. And he got sent overseas to Italy, and he served in combat as a radio operator, as a Buffalo soldier in an all-black regiment. There was about a 3-year interruption in his education while serving the army, and then he returned to Lincoln to complete his degree about halfway through his degree, and also to serve as the editor of the student newspaper, the Lincolnian, during a time when the students' Operation Oxford, or Oxford campaign, again came to kind of a fever pitch, especially given the implementation of a new kind of civil rights strategy, the sit-in, right? They started doing sit-ins. Again, we usually think of sit-ins as getting started around 1960 in places like Greensboro and Nashville and Raleigh. But these young Black college students, many of them Presbyterian, were doing sit-ins in Pennsylvania as early as 1947. These were not the very first sit-ins, but they were close. And you could probably debate which were the first, but there were some a little bit earlier at Howard University, or led by Howard University students, including Pauli Murray, who's an important civil rights leader as well, in DC, to desegregate some restaurants in DC. And she called it at the time the stool sitting technique. It was brand new, and that was 1943 and 44. And she seems to have learned about it from reading about the activities of Bayard Rustin, who was another civil rights activist, would eventually organize the March on Washington. But he had been in jail during World War II because he was a conscientious objector, because he was a Quaker pacifist. And while he was in jail, he'd been experimenting with lots of nonviolent protest strategies with the other inmates, trying to get them, to do things against the guards like sit-ins. And so she'd kind of read about, Pauli Murray had read about this, and so she started trying it. And then just a couple of years later, all these students at Lincoln start trying it too. And interestingly, at the same time, there was another future civil rights leader, Martin Luther King Jr. You may have heard of him. He was a seminary student just a couple of miles away at another school in southeastern Pennsylvania, another seminary, Crozier Seminary. Later was merged into Colgate-Rochester Crozier Seminary. He was there, I think, 48 to 51. So basically right the same time that Gay Wilmore was in seminary, they were both there at the same time. And there's one occasion when Dr. King engaged in what might be described as a sit-in, not a very well planned, but just kind of a let's try this out kind of thing. That there's a great recent book about King's seminary years called The Seminarian that has a little anecdote about that. So it's just kind of fun to think about these students kicking around these strategies, not having a whole lot of success with them at the time, but kind of trying them out and the kind of the first draft of the civil rights movement, right? Gay Wilmore participated in some of these sit-ins in the late 40s and early 50s as a seminary student at Lincoln. But I think his most interesting and important kind of way of being involved in this campaign was in his senior year in college, 1947, as the editor of the student newspaper, right? In defending the activities of a radical, rough-edged, seemingly disrespectable activist named Milton Henry, one of his classmates, who at the time was serving as the president of the campus NAACP. So this is a couple years after they refounded the chapter. It's about 5 years later, after the war. And Milton Henry, as the NAACP leader, he'd been leading this sit-in movement in Oxford, starting in that year. And of course, there was a lot of press about it, and the administration was uncomfortable with it, and they were being asked to try to tell the students to stop, as always happens, right? And Garrod Wilmore is editor of the student newspaper, and he writes editorials about the campaign. And in this editorial, he writes about the pre-war Lincoln NAACP that he'd been involved in, and the provocative tactics used by its president at the time, James Deke Johnson. You recall he was vice president, but he doesn't mention that here. He doesn't mention his involvement. He's just telling about the old days, right? According to his editorial, he says that Deke Johnson had long sought unsuccessfully to marshal student support for civil rights activism in Oxford in the early 40s. But quote, people had merely smiled at him, patted him on the back, and said, "Now, Johnson, don't get excited, old boy. You'll forget all about it," right? But in order to be taken seriously, Deke Johnson snuck out of his dormitory at night to hang a lynch rope from a tree on campus as a form of a protest, along with a sign which read "3 last week," referring to lynchings taking place in the South within the last week, trying to raise people's consciousness about that. And Gay Wilmore then recounts what happens next. Quote, "The next morning, a warm October sun gleamed down on the ominous warning, the lynch rope, and the hangman's noose swayed languidly in a breeze stirring in the direction of Oxford. A warm, sunny day. That day Deke scored, but his message was cold and grim, and we shuddered as we walked by it to class. That was the month they lynched Howard Wash in Laurel, Mississippi. And that was the year in which Lincoln students tried to do something once again about Oxford, Pennsylvania. Deke used to say that the same thing could happen in Oxford, and finally, nobody thought he was kidding," end quote. So Wilmore just tells this story of something that happened 5 years before, and then he connects it to Milton Henry, the present day activist in 47. He connects that to Deke Johnson's style of provocative, inflammatory, but ultimately effective activism, saying that Henry followed in the footsteps of those kind of activists. And the phrase he used that best encapsulates this editorial was to say, quote, "On occasion, he may be a bit undiplomatic and impulsive, but the personality of Milton Henry has nothing to do with the rightness of Milton Henry's fight for civil rights in Oxford. Jim Crow in Oxford must go. We can and must back Henry and the NAACP to the limit. So that's the quote. In the editorial, again, Wilmore didn't acknowledge that he had participated in that 1942 NAACP chapter. He also didn't acknowledge that he was actually relatively close to Milton Henry, this activist who he's kind of trying to lift up, right? They had both been involved in the Young Communist League while at Lincoln, before and perhaps also after the war, serving as delegates to communist meetings in New York City. But he doesn't mention that as the newspaper editorial, right? He writes from a position of distance as a kind of moderate, respectable campus citizen who's willing to vouch for this radical, undiplomatic, and impulsive Milton Henry. This was the first of many such occasions in which Wilmore would skillfully and strategically deploy his eloquent white writing style to promote radical causes to a broad audience by portraying himself as a voice of moderation, neutrality, and respectability in order to lift up someone else who seemed pretty radical and to give them a platform, right? He makes that move a lot. Wilmore was engaging here in a form of masking, right? He was using his own straight-laced reputation and leadership position to sort of hide his own personal feelings and make space for those who rejected any of that kind of masking and those who openly attacked white supremacy, right? So anyway, historians can argue about what event really started the civil rights movement, the Montgomery bus boycott, Brown versus Board. There's some other things people point to, but you could make an argument that Operation Oxford, led by a band of Black, many of them Presbyterian college students at Lincoln University, is a pretty good candidate for kind of when and where the civil rights movement and one of its main strategies kind of got going. So that's the college kind of anecdote right there, right? So Gayrod Wilmore was very involved in lots of other things in college. He was a valedictorian in college and in seminary. He went on to serve as a pastor in the Philadelphia suburbs in the early 50s, where he was involved in working to desegregate his son's elementary school. He worked in campus ministry. He was the first Black staffer in the social action office of the Presbyterian Church in the 50s. And then he taught at Pittsburgh Seminary as the first Black professor at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. Then in 1963, the Presbyterian Church felt really convicted by the civil rights movement, specifically the Birmingham campaign, led by Dr. King. And it also faced lots of internal pressure from Black Presbyterians who were demanding action. So it became the first majority white denomination to create an agency focused on racial justice, the Commission on Religion and Race. Now, there's a question about kind of how and why did that commission get created, and why was Wilmore in particular chosen to lead it? And I said a minute ago, the Presbyterian Church felt convicted by the civil rights movement, and that's partially true if you think of the denomination as a majority white denomination. It was partly about these kind of white people becoming more open to racial justice and feeling convicted by Dr. King talking about the white church and the white moderate. But probably more influential here was the role of pressure within the denomination from Black Presbyterians, who were a powerful, vocal, organized constituency within the denomination. And they provided internal pressure to create this new agency, basically. Black Presbyterians in the South had long been affiliated with the Northern Presbyterian Church, and so that meant when they went to Presbyterian meetings, those were majority Black presbyteries, and so there was a lot of community and solidarity among Black Presbyterians in the South. But in the North, Black Presbyterians would go to Presbyterian meetings and they would be majority white. And so they created Black caucuses, Black clergy groups, and so forth, dating back to the 19th century, informally from around the Civil War era, and then formally starting in 1894 with folks like Francis Grimke and First African Church in Philadelphia met to kind of organize these caucuses for the first time. It was initially called the Colored Presbyterian Council of Ministers and Elders in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Delaware, Maryland, and the District of Columbia. It's not a name that would really stick around, as you can expect, right? Kind of a mouthful. So they switched to a much shorter name, the Afro-American Presbyterian Council. And so that was the name for a long time. And then several decades later, 1947, yeah, it's way too long. Wouldn't even make a good acronym, right? In 1947, they decided to drop the overtly racial language in the name because that's what they wanted white people to do. And so they dropped Afro-American from the name and became the Council of the North and West. Again, because you have all these Black Presbyterians in the South, but this is Black Presbyterians not in the South. So they're in the North and the West, in the majority white spaces of the Presbyterian Church. And so they created their caucus, the Council of the North and West, with a supposedly sort of non-racial name, right? So this organization was a source of community, but it was also a really important political pressure group within the denomination. It was sort of like a denomination within the denomination. They had their own officers at a time when Black people were not really permitted to be officers in the larger denomination, with a few exceptions. And so this is, 1940s, 1950s. There was a kind of an optimism in the 1950s about civil rights, or you could even call it naivete. How much do you want to look back with 2020 vision on this? But this Black caucus in 1957 voted to disband itself because it thought it was no longer needed. It thought that we were headed towards an era of integration. And again, it was sort of trying to set a model for white people and say, look, we don't want you all to have racially exclusive groups, so we're not going to have a racially exclusive group at all. We're just going to be Presbyterian, not Black Presbyterian. They realized pretty quickly that was a mistake. And so 6 years later, 1963, they reorganized again under the name of Concerned Presbyterians under Bryant George and Edler Hawkins. But again, notice they were uncomfortable about having Black or African-American in the name. So they called it Concerned Presbyterians, again, sort of non-racial kind of a name. A couple of years later, the Black Power era, they lost that uncomfortability, Black pride and Black theology. And so that's when you switch to the Black Presbyterians United, reorganized in 1963 under Edler Hawkins, Tony Butts, Thelma Adair, BPU. Surely many of you all know that story or different pieces of that story very well. And now, of course, we have the National Black Presbyterian Caucus. So anyway, back in 1963, this group is recreated after being disbanded as Concerned Presbyterians. And Edler Hawkins is running for moderator to try to be the first Black moderator of the Presbyterian Church. He loses by 2 votes in Des Moines, Iowa in 1963. And there's tremendous pressure as a part of this meeting exerted by this renewed Black caucus and demonstrated by Hawkins' moderator campaign and the work of other leaders like James Robinson to try to get the denomination to create this new racial justice organization or commission. And there's a sense in which the commission was sort of a consolation prize for Hawkins' defeat, even though he would then run again the next year and win and become the moderator. So that's kind of how it gets created. We don't know for sure why they chose Gayrod Wilmore to lead the Commission on Religion and Race, but there are some theories, and my favorite is one posited by Oscar McLeod, who some of you all know, a close friend and associate of Wilmore's. And he says that Wilmore at the time was seen as an academic and not an activist. He suggests that if Black Presbyterians had been able to select the agency's director all by themselves, they might have chosen somebody like South Carolina pastor and civil rights activist J. Herbert Nelson I, the father of the present-day stated clerk, who was more of a firebrand activist and an outspoken presence at General Assembly every year. But Wilmore was a professor at Pittsburgh and a doctoral student and sort of seen as an egghead, right, by some people. He was not particularly engaged in social action at that moment. He was focused on teaching and studying and family life. But those who paid closer attention to his career knew that he had these other racial justice and activist kind of roots to him. White Presbyterians didn't know that. They didn't know about his activism at Lincoln or about his school desegregation stuff in suburban Philadelphia in the early 50s. Because lots of the civil rights activism in those early days was only covered in local newspapers or in the national black press. It was not covered in the white press. And so the white people didn't know about that kind of stuff from his background. But Black Presbyterians knew about a lot of these things because Black Presbyterianism in the kind of mid-Atlantic area was a really small world. There were only 2 Black Presbyterian seminaries, and there was this whole thing about the Council of the North and West, right? And all the major Black Presbyterian ministers in that region, they would go to these meetings of the Council of the North and West, and a lot of them had gone to Lincoln University, and so they were all connected through their professors and all these different kind of things. And so they knew him, and they knew about his commitment to racial justice and his roots. And so that's one theory about kind of why he was selected, is that white Presbyterians saw him as a kind of a safe choice, and Black Presbyterians were kind of like, he's maybe not as radical as we might like him to be, but we know that his heart's in the right place and he'll be on our side. Right. So he becomes the executive director of this commission. He served in that role until 1971. He was at all the big marches. He helped guide the church in contributing lots of money to support civil rights groups. That's one of the biggest roles that happened here, was shepherding all these funds from this majority white church into groups like the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and also in promoting voter registration in Mississippi and lobbying for passage of the Civil and Voting Rights Acts. The signing of the Voting Rights Act on August 6th of 1965 was a moment of triumph for Gay Wilmore and for lots of other people. It was very exciting. But there was also a very quick turnaround that happened right there, because less than a week later, in August of 1965, a rebellion erupted in response to police violence in the Watts neighborhood of Los Angeles. Starting in the mid-60s, the civil rights movement shifts its focus from nonviolent marches in the South to a series of rebellions or insurrections, which critics sometimes call riots, in non-Southern cities, right, in the North and the West, right? Watts in Los Angeles, in Detroit, in Newark, really every city, especially in the North and on the West Coast. These demonstrators were inspired by civil rights, but they were also responding to economic inequities and police violence, right, if that sounds familiar. So August 1965, the Watts Rebellion breaks out. Gay Wilmore and Martin Luther King Jr. both head straight to the scene, to Watts. And Wilmore tells a story about finding himself huddled behind a barricade erected by armed Black Presbyterians in Los Angeles as they fended off marauding Hell's Angels. A few days later, King and Wilmore were both scheduled to speak at a Christian Action Conference in Montreat, North Carolina. And King was delayed in getting there because he was still stuck in Watts dealing with the aftermath of that. And Wilmore was able to get out and get over to Montreat. And they were both, Wilmore and King were both on the speaking docket, but they switched their time slots. So Wilmore spoke first on the first day of the conference, and King spoke a couple of days later in the conference. And so Wilmore gave the opening speech for the conference. And he immediately came to the defense of the Watts rebels. And again, similar to how he'd done with Milton Henry, this NAACP leader, campus leader years ago, who people thought was a little bit out there, he defends these Watts rebels, so-called rioters, and tries to translate what these protesters were really saying into language that, in this case, white Southern Presbyterians could maybe hear, right? And help people understand that. And so he said, speaking in Montreat, quote, "The demonstrators of the ghetto are saying, hey, look at me, take account of me, I'm a person. You're going to pay some attention to me because I'm going to walk down your main street in the middle of the day. I'm Black, I'm a person, I'm poor, I'm an American, and I will not let you rest in your tranquil community any longer." This is what the people are really saying, right? But the most important passage from Wilmore's speech showed how the Watts Rebellion had really changed his perspective. This was a turning point for Wilmore in his way of connecting to the civil rights movement. He suddenly identified with civil rights in a way that he had not previously. He had already been really involved in the movement, clearly. I mean, he was leading this agency, but something about that shift from the South into the slums of the northern cities really struck a chord with him. And so he said, quote, "What can we learn about these riots? As brilliant as the civil rights leaders are," and here he's talking about Dr. King and other Southern Black clergy, "as brilliant as the civil rights leaders are, they do not know what it is to face policemen every night. They don't know what it is to fight rats all day, to have to sit up in bed with a pair of shoes to throw at them. They don't know what it is to be emasculated when your wife works and you can't work. She's able to earn something in a white suburban kitchen. They don't know what it is to have their dignity taken away from them by the condition of the American Negro family in the deepest heart of the ghettos of the North and West." And then he added that the movement, as it had been led thus far by people like King, does not reach the deepest needs of these people, which is spiritual as well as material, right? Economics. Dr. Wilmore had grown up in the ghettos of the North and West that he's talking about in Philadelphia. His mother had earned a living for the family by working in white suburban kitchens. His father was unemployed and seeking work for long stretches of his childhood during the Great Depression. Despite his celebrated veteran status, employment was still very difficult. So Wilmore saw himself in those Watts rebels, and he recognized that the Southern clergy, like Dr. King, many of them were more middle class, not all of them clearly. They'd certainly faced their own forms of suffering under Jim Crow, but they didn't fully understand the plight of these urban, poor, non-Southern African Americans in places like Watts and Philadelphia, a plight that Wilmore himself knew very well. And for the first time, I think he really saw the cause of civil rights as fully his own in a way, right? He's fighting for his own people here, for the people he really grew up with. And it kind of reminds me of the prophet Esther, right? Realizing that she's come into a position for such a time as this, seeing it's my people being oppressed, if you know that story, right? So I think that's kind of realizing a real strong identification with the people he's advocating for. So I think that's just a really important turning point for him as we move into the late 60s and the Black Power era, when he becomes kind of even more prominent as an activist in some ways. So a year later, June of 1966, the Black Power movement begins, and with the Memphis to Jackson March Against Fear. Black Power is a more militant phase of the civil rights movement and reflects, again, a lot of these concerns of Black people in the slums of northern cities, non-Southern cities, right? Dr. Wilmore responded to Black Power by working with several others to develop a Black Christian response to this new idea of Black Power. And they created an organization called the National Conference of Black Churchmen. And it's had some different name changes, but the NCBC was the consistent acronym. And they released the new group's first public statement as a Christian endorsement of Black Power in a full-page ad in the New York Times with 48 signatories from several denominations, including a lot of Northern Black clergy from majority white denominations, but others as well, AME folks and AME Zion. And they thought of themselves as a more radical Northern counterpart to Dr. King's Southern Christian Leadership Conference. You know, this early civil rights, this is Black Power and the church, right? This is the beginning of the academic field of Black theology, trying to figure out a Christian basis, a theological basis for Black Power, right? Seeing this stuff about Black Power in the news, okay, we're Christians, how do we think about that in a Christian lens, right? So Wilmore helps found this, and he's the head of the group's theological commission, which means he's the one who actually wrote most of its public statements, as was what James Cone has said. He was still the executive director for this Presbyterian Racial Justice Agency, which is interesting. He's leading this effort for a majority white church, and he's also leading this Black Power organization. But he got his second in command from the Presbyterian organization, Black Presbyterian minister Metz Rollins, to switch over to this Black Power organization and become the full-time executive director of this new organization. And the Presbyterian Church continued to pay his salary, right? So the Presbyterian Church was paying the salary of the executive director for this major Christian Black Power organization, ecumenical organization. And it was, interestingly, it was also paying the salary of one of Dr. King's lieutenants in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference as well, Hosea Williams. So again, you know, a lot of shepherding the funds from the denomination into these different racial justice efforts, a lot of what they were doing. So one of the most interesting things that I found in my research, especially thinking about Presbyterianism, Reformed tradition, and Black theology, right, is a key connection between the Reformed tradition and the creation of Black theology. And I like to hear what you all think about this as well in the discussion time. But sometimes people use the term kind of Black theology or Black liberation theology to refer to kind of political activist theology among Black Christians over several hundred years. But specifically, I'm going to talk here about kind of the academic field of Black theology starting in the 60s and centered around James Cone, and then the continuing legacy of that for the last 50 years. I argue that it's very likely that Garrod Wilmore is the one who actually coined the term Black theology, and that he was the person most responsible for coming up with this basic idea. And this is what's really interesting, is that in doing so, he was drawing directly on the Reformed tradition in some ways. I'll explain to you how that works. In 1958, so moving back a little bit, late 50s, there's a merger of these two Presbyterian denominations to form the United Presbyterian Church. And the denominations decided to create a new confession to mark the occasion, and that wound up becoming the Confession of 1967, right? And so they because that's when it became official, right? 9 years later. But they created a committee, a drafting committee, to write this new confession. And the committee decided to come up with, or the denomination decided to come up with a book of confessions at the time, and not just to have the Westminster Confession as their only confession, but to create a book that had 7 different historic confessions of the church, and then to add an 8th, which reflected the present day circumstances in the 1960s, the Confession of 1967, with that date to mark that it was talking about, here's what's going on now. And just a lot about kind of thinking about context in church tradition, and the confessions all come from particular contexts, right? This new confession directly addressed racial injustice. Garrod Wilmore was on the drafting committee, and he wrote the initial draft of the passages in that confession that condemn racial discrimination, economic oppression, and militarism. And you can go look in the Confession of 1967 in the Book of Confessions, and you'll see those sections. There's a 4th section there that has to do with gender. It was added in by committees later on that was reflecting a compromise statement from people who couldn't agree about gender and sexuality. He didn't write that part, but the other parts he wrote. So when you read or recite from that confession, you can thank Garrod Wilmore for those sections. So that's really great. But overall, Dr. Wilmore had a really negative experience on that committee. He didn't feel like he was listened to or his opinion was valued. And this is really because there were 15 people on that committee that drafted this confession, 13 white guys, a lot of them Princeton Seminary professors. Gay Wilmore was the only person of color, and there was one white woman, Janet Harbison. And Janet Harbison, she was a major figure in her own right, but she has said that she thought she was chosen because her husband was a church historian as well. And so they really wanted him to be a part of the committee, not so much her, right? So they were on the committee, but they were very much second-class members of the committee, right? And she later said she was told at one point that by that point in time, this is progress, the committee thought they needed to have at least one woman and one Black person, but no more than that, right? That would be kind of too much at the time. Late 50s we're talking about. Dr. Wilmore drops off the committee around 1963 or 64. He doesn't formally resign. He just quits coming to the meetings because of some of these concerns that he had. And also he's super busy. That's when he's getting involved leading this new commission on religion and race. So he just kind of quits showing up to these meetings where he wasn't really being listened to, he felt like. Now, a couple years later, as I discussed, 1966, he and others create this National Conference of Black Churchmen, this group of Black clergy supporting Black power, and are starting to figure out about Black power and Black theology, right? The term Black theology seems to have arisen from this group's discourse in the year 1968. It appears in a couple of news articles that fall reporting on the proceedings of this organization's 2nd annual meeting, its 2nd convocation in St. Louis. and a report by Gayraud Wilmore for the group's theological commission at the time, which was again reflecting on the discussions they had just had at this convocation. Dr. Wilmore's report used that term twice, Black theology. He wrote that the commission was working to bring Black scholars together, quote, on a few key questions in the current discussion about a Black theology, in quotes. And he also said there was a feeling in this circle that, quote, something is stirring in parts of the Black church, that there is a kind of Black theology, again, in quotes, a kind of Black theology aborning, right? Being born. That's the title of this church. Those are the first two written references ever that we know of to the term Black theology. And both times he puts the term in quotes, indicating that it was a new idea. Now, Dr. Wilmore never claimed to have invented the term. And so what may have happened was that it came into use in conversation with these Black pastors and scholars organically. And it could be that he's the one who chose these words to encapsulate these ideas swirling around, or it could be that everybody at this meeting found themselves using this term, and then he's the one who tells the world about it, right? But either way, that's the first known use of that term in print by a supporter of the idea of Black theology. So I think that's pretty cool. As a side note, the term womanist theology also comes from Black Presbyterians. Think about Black feminist theology, right? The term womanist comes from Alice Walker, the novelist, but adding theology to the end of it comes from Reverend Dr. Katie Geneva Cannon as well. So Black Presbyterians get credit for at least the terms Black theology and womanist theology, and a lot of the content of those ideas as well, which are of course ecumenical movements, right? You might wonder, where was James Cone in all of this, right? Didn't he come up with Black theology, right? He's the most prominent name in the early era of Black theology. He was certainly the most important in kind of popularizing the term and filling out its theological content, but he was building on the work of these other scholars. By the time James Cone's first book comes out in April of 1969, Garrod Wilmore had been leading this group of Black clergy, this Black caucus, for 3 years and kicking around these ideas about Black theology. And then here comes this kind of unknown theologian named James Cone, nobody's heard of, and he writes this book. And Dr. Wilmore has written about his response to that. Quote, I remember someone giving me a review of Cone's book in an unguarded moment. I whooped for joy. Here was a mature and scholarly presentation, albeit ebullient with youth, of what we could not find words to say from the first day that Benjamin Peyton and I sat down in his office to compose the draft of the Black Power Statement, which was essentially the first document of Black theology, right? You could think about. Who was this young professor who articulated the faith of the new breed of Black churchmen as if he had been present at every interminable committee meeting and midnight bull session that had taken place among the members of the NCBC from its inception? It was for me a moment of spiritual exaltation, and I went out to find the book, which I read through in one sitting, right? So he's probably a little annoyed he didn't come up with this way of talking about it by himself, but mostly he's talked about just being so thrilled that somebody finally put exactly the right words on what they had been kicking around, which is, he's a remarkable wordsmith himself, right? But this was, he and other Black scholars had started the conversation and brainstormed about it and built a social network around it, but they didn't have a coherent, systematic way of articulating it. And then James Cone shows up and does that for them, and they welcome him into their ranks with open arms, right? Now, there's another piece of this story about the origins of Black theology, and that's its connection to the Reformed tradition specifically. And it goes back to Wilmore's service on the drafting committee to create the Confession of 1967, right? He made some important contributions to it, but then he walked away from that pretty frustrated. And he was sort of reacting against a certain version of the Reformed tradition at the time, against all these white male Princeton seminary professors, right? That certain version of Presbyterianism, Reformed tradition. But even as he was reacting against some aspects of the Reformed tradition there and saying, well, let's just talk about Black theology, right? He was also drawing on that tradition in other ways, so much so that I think it's reasonable to think of the NCBC and Black theology as, at least in some respects, not a rejection of the Reformed tradition, but actually as kind of a development within the Reformed tradition. For Wilmore, I think that creating all the statements of the National Conference of Black Churchmen, right? There's this whole set of statements, the Black Power statement and the statement about Adam Clayton Powell and so on and so forth. He was actually working with others to create his own version of a book of confessions. And he was drawing directly on those Reformed documents that formed the Book of Confessions in creating Black theology. And the most intriguing evidence to this effect, for me, is Wilmore's reference to the Theological Declaration of Barmen in that 1968 report, the one where he first talks about Black theology for the first time. He refers to the Declaration of Barmen. As many of you know, the Barmen Declaration was an anti-Nazi statement by Reformed churches in 1930s Germany. It was one of the 8 confessions that was put into this new Book of Confessions. And it arose out of a situation known as a status confessionis, a term in Reformed theology that refers to a dire situation, a serious crisis where one must draw a line in the sand by writing a confession. And the confession of 1967 was not really that kind of confession. It was focused on kind of clearing up some issues about biblical and confessional stuff, not responding to a big crisis. But the Barmen Declaration was responding to Nazis, right? That was Wilmore's problem with the confession of 1967, because he did think there was a dire, serious crisis going on that the church had to respond to. And that was the crisis of racism in America. So in his 1968 report, he writes that the NCBC members hope to create, quote, some kind of Barmen Declaration of Black churchmen in the face of the repressive and genocidal racism of American society, end quote. He also wrote that Black scholars were trying to develop a, quote, a basic theological position paper, an embryonic confessional statement, or a contemporary pronouncement akin to the Barmen Declaration, end quote. So I think Wilmore thought the church was in a status confessionis, a crisis situation comparable to that of Nazi Germany, to which it must respond clearly and directly. And when the Presbyterian Drafting Committee didn't recognize that, he goes out and he sets up his own committee to create a confession, indeed a book of confessions, responding to the crisis of racism in America. And I think we can see, again, the NCBC's public documents as kind of a book of confessions for the tradition of Black theology. Black theology is, of course, a much bigger idea than the thought of any one or two of these people, or even of this particular organization, right? It's a much broader kind of a sense. But I think it's fair to say that this form of theology arose in the 1960s, at least in part as a direct result of this Black Presbyterian leader drawing on the theology of the Reformed tradition, among other things, so that, again, you could see this as kind of a development within the Reformed tradition, right, and not necessarily, just a separate from it. So I think that's kind of cool. That's, you heard about how Garrod Wilmore became Presbyterian. This is how Black theology comes from Black Presbyterianism in some ways. I also want to say a little about Wilmore's engagement with the idea of reparations and the Black Manifesto in the late 60s. So James Cone, his first book comes out in April of 1969, Black Theology and Black Power, Wilmore's really excited about. There was actually a different publication that same month that caught more headlines and took up most of Dr. Wilmore's energy for the entire rest of the year. And that was a document called the Black Manifesto, a document produced by activist James Forman, demanding that the nation's white churches and synagogues pay $500 million in reparations due to their past complicity in slavery and discrimination. It didn't capture the nation's attention until a couple weeks later, May of 1969, when James Forman marches into Sunday worship at Riverside Church in New York City to protest the manifesto, or to present the manifesto over the protest of the church's pastor and its members. And then over the next few months, Forman and his associates do the same thing at the headquarters of lots of majority white denominations and religious institutions. These events were kind of a shock to white mainline church leaders and majority white denominations. A lot of them felt like they had been doing a lot of good things for racial justice. And so they didn't really like being made out to be the enemy and being told they're complicit. But a lot of Black clergy in these same denominations who are already members of the NCBC and already supportive of Black power and Black theology, they were supportive of reparations and of the manifesto, and they endorsed it. And that's where kind of Gay Wilmore's unique style of leadership comes in. Janet Harbison, the white woman who was on the confession committee with him, she described him, she's a journalist, and she described him as a solid Black hyphen, which it was the title of my dissertation, is what I use for that, which is to say that he was a hyphen because he was a connector, a bridge builder, right? But he was also solidly Black. He was firmly committed to Black people and racial justice, but also willing to reach out to different kinds of communities. And you can see that here. He fully supports this reparations effort, but he does that with a kind of a translating discourse designed to reach out to white liberals and convince them to come around to support it as well. He was radical, but he was also an official with institutional power. He was still the head of this committee for the denomination. And so he uses that position to support more radical figures from a position of apparent moderation and respectability, right? So he does this work of translating, and it's the same way that he had explained the Watts Rebellion in Montreat before, and all the way back in his college days from his student newspaper, it's the same way that he explained the tactics of the student NAACP. And you recall he'd written about that student leader from Lincoln University. On occasion, he may be a bit undiplomatic and impulsive, but the personality of Milton Henry has nothing to do with the rightness of Milton Henry's fight for civil rights in Oxford. Well, now, Dr. Wilmore was basically saying about James Forman, he might be a bit undiplomatic and impulsive, but the personality of James Forman has nothing to do with the rightness of reparations. Again, similar to with Milton Henry years before, Garrod Wilmore was actually personally close to the radical that he wound up defending. Though in this case, he doesn't distance himself from him. He uses it as a way to vouch for Forman. Wilmore and Forman had worked together for many years in the civil rights movement. And so Wilmore vouches for him in a sermon saying, you know, I've walked picket lines with him and labored with him in the backwoods of Mississippi, and I trust his sincerity, right? So that's a little bit different. He also says that on the day that Forman first publicly presented the manifesto, he says Forman had come to him that morning. I don't know exactly, I mean, I don't know if Wilmore was in Detroit or what, but he'd come to him to share the contents and ask his opinion about what he planned to do. Without realizing the full implications of the moment, Wilmore had said something like, sure, why don't you do it? That sounds good. So he's kind of has some responsibility for getting Forman going in a way. But that pre-existing relationship with Forman meant Wilmore was willing to vouch for Forman and counsel Forman. It also helps explain why Forman, who is an atheist, why he brought his demands to churches rather than to the government or other entities, because he'd worked with so many church people in the civil rights movement, and he recognized how committed they were to this work. And so he was like, well, will you all really live into this or not? Let's see. So I'll skip a couple of things. So there's this whole campaign by folks to try to present Forman and defend Forman and in a lot of different ways. And there are different protest actions. Forman and his supporters liberate Presbyterian denominational offices in New York. They kind of like an occupation, right? They appear at the church's General Assembly in San Antonio, and Wilmore's engaged in trying to get an invitation to Forman to come and formally speak. So he's not going to do a protest, just to have him come and speak to the assembly, and trying to stage manages that to try to make Forman look sort of more presentable in Wilmore's opinion, right? And that works pretty well. Some people are, of course, unhappy about it and are critical. One staffer recalls that commissioners discussed buying baseball bats, which they referred to as toothpicks, in case Forman became disruptive or violent, right? And there's one prominent lay leader who's reported to have threatened Wilmore with violence for his role in inviting Forman. But people didn't know that there was actually much more danger going on behind the scenes at this moment. Almost nobody knew this at the time, but Wilmore spent a lot of that assembly in a hotel room in this almost like a hostage negotiation going on. his hotel suite was occupied by an armed group of young Black revolutionaries sympathetic to James Forman, probably not under Forman's control, but sympathetic to him. And they had this plan to go into the General Assembly from the balcony and point their guns at all the commissioners and demand they pass reparations, which would have made the toothpicks basically like toothpicks, right? Wilmore talked them out of it, right? These young revolutionaries. He identified with them, he understood where they're coming from, and he talked them out of this sort of this wacky kind of scheme. The Assembly voted to do some of these things. They voted to pay $100,000 to an organization connected to Forman and to seek to raise $50 million over the next decade or so to contribute to anti-poverty efforts, particularly in Black communities. And I'll come back to that in a few minutes. It wasn't what Forman asked for, but it was something, and whatever it was a credit to Wilmore and to other Black Presbyterians at the time. Important parts of the way that Wilmore's strategy worked, he translated Forman's language into language more accessible to white liberals. He portrayed Forman as a prophet, and he argued for the effectiveness of Forman's tactics, right? He defended reparations and said it was a pretty straightforward kind of a thing, and he pointed to different examples from history. He also portrayed Forman as a prophet, comparing to the prophet Amos in particular. That comparison worked pretty well because prophets in the Bible usually are people who don't really get along with anybody. They don't dress very well. They don't show up at the right time. They usually tick everybody off and make a mess, right? And that sort of made sense to people, like, oh, okay, that maybe James Forman's a prophet. That explains why I really don't like him, but maybe his message is still something we should listen to. And so he does that comparison, which I think works pretty well. Again, they weren't able to get everything passed, but Wilmore also talked about how Forman's strategy was necessary and effective. He said the tactics of confrontation were necessary to provoke the nation to recognize the seriousness of the demand for justice. And I think that recalls Deke Johnson at Lincoln hanging a noose on Lincoln's campus to raise interest, right? Doing something really out there and provocative. Wilmore said that when the powerful ignore soft words and polite entreaties, then those who are weak must make a louder noise and grasp the attention of those who ignore them by direct and physical confrontation, by a protest that is not orderly or genteel. And he cited precedents for disruptive tactics, comparing Forman to lots of heroic biblical Christian and American characters who had been somewhat unpleasant and disorderly. And so this is one of my favorite quotes from him. If these tactics of James Forman, if these tactics are wrong, then the triumphal entry was wrong, the temple cleansing was wrong, so was the civil disobedience of the early church, the nailing of the 95 Theses on the church door at Wittenberg, the Boston Tea Party, the conspiracy against the Fugitive Slave Act, and demonstrations, strikes, and boycotts of the labor movement for recognition and collective bargaining. If American Christians can't condone violence, they must at least concede that disruptive confrontation is as Christian as street corner revivals and as American as the 4th of July. End quote. Garrod Wilmore also wrote that James Forman's tactics of hardline and aggressive action worked better than standard procedures. They avoided being sidetracked by the usual bureaucratic procrastination and endless red tape. And they created a sense of urgency and determination that achieved what years of gentle prodding by church executives had not been able to achieve. Now, Garrod Wilmore's own work, a lot of it had been bureaucracy, gentle prodding, standard procedures, soft words and polite entreaties, orderliness and gentility. That was his mode of action. Like a lot of other people, they'd been doing those kind of things, but then Forman's the one who gets all this attention and all this energy going, and he realizes that's actually kind of a good strategy in some ways, similar to Milton Henry and Deke Johnson from his Lincoln days. Those were the things that were effective at getting white people's attention and getting some kind of response. Wilmore was still uncomfortable with the way that those kind of radicals expressed themselves, And he saw his role as trying to soften the edges of that rhetoric and make it make sense to other kinds of people. But he still, you see appreciation for how they could, sometimes the tactics of those activists could end the conversation before it could begin, but other times it could jumpstart a conversation that had kind of stalled. Despite despite the successes of this strategy, Foreman was unsuccessful in getting reparations from almost everybody he sought it from. There were a couple of exceptions. There was a fund created by the Episcopal Church and by the Presbyterian Church. The General Assembly approved, again, $100,000 for an organization connected to Foreman, and they promised to raise some additional funds over the next 10 years. Then the next year, Wilmore and Black Presbyterians, particularly from the Catawba Presbytery in the South, were able to pressure the denomination to go ahead and create that initiative, which was called the Program for the Self-Development of People, right? You may have heard of it, still around. And it promised, it raised over $20 million in the next 10 years for community development groups in impoverished communities to allow the members of those communities to manage the funds themselves without a lot of oversight and paternalism, in the kind of the spirit of Black power. That fund, that program is still active today. It continues to be funded by the denomination, and several $100,000 a year is paid out, and it relies on an offering taken up once a year in congregations in the PCUSA, the One Great Hour of Sharing offering. Now, it's not exactly reparations because it's based on social class, not race. We don't use the language of reparations when we promote it. People, it's just kind of an offering. But I think it's significant that it comes from this particular response from Black Presbyterians pressuring the denomination to do something like reparations. And I think it's also kind of helpful when we think about reparations. Sometimes that conversation gets shut down because people just think, well, we can't just have direct checks from the government, right? We obviously have direct checks from the government now for all kinds of things, but they think of it as kind of an all or nothing thing. I think it's helpful to see these kind of smaller piecemeal efforts by different higher education institutions to create scholarships and thinking about their own histories in relation to slavery, right? To kind of think about what are some different innovative, smaller ways that other institutions can work towards something like reparations. So I'll go ahead and conclude. That's a few of the contributions, the many contributions of Garrod Wilmore. There's so many more. There's rich scholarship by him that continues from the 70s into the 21st century. He passed away in April of 2020 at age 98. But I think his memory is experiencing a revival, particularly on the campus of Louisville Presbyterian Seminary, where I taught for the past 2 years. I'm not there now, but I was there for the last 2 years. In 2019, the seminary awarded Dr. Wilmore the first honorary doctorate it had granted anybody in the, 150 years of that seminary's history. And then just last year, in the wake of the protests following the murders of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, who was from Louisville, the seminary's Black students formed an organization known as the Gayraud Wilmore Society of Black Seminarians. And that brings us full circle again to think back about that 20-year-old college sophomore, Gayrod Wilmore, back in 1942, just a few months after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, becoming the founding vice president of his own Black student group, NAACP chapter, and starting engaging in sit-ins. So even as this titan of Black history and Presbyterian history and civil rights history no longer walks among us, his memory and his legacy live on in the zeal of these young people and older people who continue to do this kind of activism and continue to do what's called for in Dr. Wilmore's favorite Bible verse, to groan and travail together, working for racial justice. So that's my presentation. I'll be happy to talk further, take questions, or however you want to do this going forward. But thanks so much for your attention. Very long period of me talking right there.
Thank you, Douglas. That is really wonderful. Can you update us on your publication schedule? You're bringing this to press, are you?
It's not imminent. So I'm in a new job this year, teaching a very heavy teaching load. So it's I'm not working on it at the moment, but I definitely in the next in the next year or two, I hope to get a contract and get that going. So
this is terrific. Really great research. You've tied together so many things. I think everybody in this room knows a little or a lot about all of this. So let's just go into a time of conversation. Unmute yourselves if you have a question or a comment.
So we want to probably try to do this a little bit in order. If we can use the raise hand feature, because there's a lot of people here. So if you have a question, if you could raise your hand, I'll let Dwight know in order who raised their hand. And when you hear your name called, you can go off mute, ask your question. I believe we might have one or two people on the phone. And if there's any like Zoom professionals, I should know this, but I hardly ever join Zoom on the phone. So if you know how to raise your hand by phone, could you share that?
And Shani?
Yes.
Do you also want to give the option of people putting their question in the chat?
Absolutely.
And we can read those questions for them.
Absolutely. And thanks, Director of Communications. You cannot raise your hand on the phone. So you'll just have to come off mute and ask your question. So
All right.
Hello?
Eugene.
Yes. I am Eugene Turner. Dr. Gayraud Wilmore taught me at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And from there, he went to the position at the General Assembly that the speaker so ably described. We remained friends, and finally, Gayrod asked me to edit a book written by several admiring theologians and other kinds of leaders in the church. And so I edited the book. It's called Dissent and Empowerment, Essays in Honor of Garrod Wilmore. Wilmore. That was a great thing, and I read it again in preparation for this discussion. I didn't know where this discussion was going to go. I am very impressed with Dr. Clark, and I hope he publishes the information he shared, because history should have that information. I thank him very much.
thank you, and thank you for that book as well. Dissent and Empowerment has been a great resource to me as well in my own work. So.
Ms. Swan, I think did you have your hand up next? I thought I saw. You're on mute.
Speak. Hello.
Hello.
So,
I've enjoyed the lecture very much. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And so much of it I did not know, but I'm very pleased that it has been done so well. I'm thinking back to the days of my NAACP membership when I was a young girl, and how much that has meant to Gay as well in his life. And that part helped me a great deal.
Thank you. And I believe I have you to thank in part for growing up in a desegregated school system in Charlotte-Mecklenburg schools as well, if I have that right. So
Yes.
Thank you for that.
Yes.
Chuck Booker.
Dr. Clark, thank you so much for the presentation. I'm the pastor of Bethesda Presbyterian Church here in National Capital Presbytery. And when I was a member of a church in Marin City, California, St. Andrew Presbyterian Church, that was seminal in the Angela Davis Black Defense Fund, one of the greatest missiological controversies in the 20th century in the old UPC USA. And I did an oral history on it. I'm just curious, do you know, I'm not familiar of Dr. Wilmore's involvement with COCAR and the Council on Church and Race, and if there was any connection with that great controversy in 1970, 71, 72.
There was. That's the last chapter in my dissertation. And it's the only one that I didn't talk about from today, but there was, and it's a lot of it was a legacy of the work that he and other people had done to create these agencies within the church and to get them to not have to deal with a whole lot of white church oversight, so they could act independently. And that's part of when they ran into some trouble, because they did act independently and they did what seemed to them to be very, clearly demanded by the gospel. And yet they still had to deal with all this kind of backlash from the whole rest of the church. So yeah, so there's a lot there, but that's definitely a piece of it as well. It was also right at the moment when Dr. Wilmore was on his way out of that and moving into scholarship. And so I think some of the challenges of that communication loop were partly about that he was sort of on his way into other kinds of things. And it's not that he kind of neglected that crisis, but so much of the work that you see him doing in the Black Manifesto crisis, I think there are some things that then didn't happen in the Davis crisis that maybe could have made some of those communication gaps happen better. But ultimately what they did was they decided that it made sense for the church to defend against a kind of illegal lynching, but the person they were choosing was a female communist, and it was gonna blow up the church one way or the other. And it was just kind of like, all right. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot more we could get into with that.
I believe the next question would be from Marvin Dandridge Wilmore.
Oh,
Thank you.
hello. Can you hear me?
Hello.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, I'm the nephew of Dr. Gayraud Wilmore.
Mhm.
I really consider myself his favorite nephew. Over the years, we've had many discussions. And it's ironic that in the early 70s, I joined the Black Christian Nationalist Church, led by Reverend Albert Beach Clegg,
Right.
who was also known as father of Black theology.
Right.
And you'd be surprised that my Uncle Gay wrote him a letter telling him that his nephew has become a part of it. And he was so proud of me that I was really trying to do something for the upliftment of Black people. And he's been my favorite. And I've been very fortunate to be able to sit down with him, hug him, and really love him. And I presently stay in what he liked to call the old homestead, his mother and father's house in Philadelphia.
That's right. Yeah.
And so I am a proud nephew of Dr. Gayraud Wilmore. And it's also ironic that in his book with Cone on Black religion and Black radicalism, there's a whole chapter in there on Black Christian nationalism.
Right.
Like I said, the ideology was different, but they respected each other.
Right.
And, two great men. But my uncle, I had to say my uncle was something else. All right,
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm gonna take, give me 1 second. There are some questions coming in the chat, and then I'll go back to some raised hands. So going back to, and thank you for my friends that are helping me have another set of eyes. So Bruce Douglas said in the first part of his academic career, Wilmore was an ethicist. In the later part, he became a historian. Do you have anything you can tell us about why that happened?
I can. I saw that question. It's a good question. And there is an answer, which is that he had been a part of, he wrote the first book that was a history book, was Black Religion, Black Radicalism in the early 70s. And really that book was reflecting on Black religious history in light of the Black Power movement. And in light of the fact that in his observation, a lot of young Black Power radicals didn't feel very connected to the church, and they felt like the church was kind of backward. And some church leaders felt like Black Power was not Christian enough and that it was a little bit out there. And he was trying to tie those two together and say that Black radicalism comes from the church, from people like Nat Turner and Mother Emanuel Church and the Denmark Vesey Rebellion, from rebellions of enslaved people. And to say that the Black church also is indebted to those kinds of things as well, and just kind of say they should be close allies to one another. And so that required him to go back through history and find the roots of what seemed to other people to be a new thing that didn't have anything to do with religion or with Christianity, and to say, no, it has all these historical roots, and I will show you that in this scholarship. And that's how he gets into that.
Thank you. Next chat question. Douglas said Wilmore made many people, many people do not respond to quiet voices and soft words, but they would respond to angry outbursts. Did he think these outbursts led to long-lasting outcomes?
It's hard to tell because, again, Dr. Wilmore's style was not to engage in those outbursts and not even really to look for them. It was a much more kind of gentle, kind of working with people and talking. I mean, he was an academic in kind of the way that he wrote about things and everything, but he has this keen appreciation for this other kind of strategy. And I think, I mean, he may have been changed in part by the Foreman deal, and I think that may have been part of what eventually led him sort of out of the church bureaucracy in a way, because he recognized how much of almost a fool's errand that was at times to him, and so he moved into scholarly circles where he wasn't quite under the thumb of these kind of other leaders. But I mean, I don't know how much of it is my own way of thinking about social change and how much of it is his, but there could be kind of a symbiotic relationship between these two. And you could recognize that you need some people who are out there kind of shaking things up, and then some other people who are able to explain that to other people at the same time. And if you're missing one of the two, it's not going to work as well. So, but I'd like to ask him what he thinks about that.
Bernice, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, actually, mine is not a question, it's more of a comment. I serving as moderator to Black Presbyterians when Dr. Wilmore was able to attend. He said to me one day, I think he may have been around 95 years old, and he said, Bernice, I just feel that there's something more that I need to do. I'm like, Dr. Wilmore, what more do you think you can do? I mean, I was aware of his writings and his work, and listening to you tonight, Dr. Clark, and thank you for the information. I asked the question again, Dr. Wilmore, what more could you have done? I mean, he did so much, but he still felt that at 95 years old that he had not done all that he had to do. So, wow, what a man.
Yeah. Some people are like that. I mean, they just do and do and do, and that's, you know, that's.
Dr. Clark, I want to thank you for your presentation. It was tremendous. As a matter of fact, just before our event tonight, I was actually listening to one of your presentations on YouTube. I think it was Black church culture, or I'm not quite sure what it was. I have it written down here somewhere, but I'm going to get back to that YouTube presentation and finish listening to it because it was very interesting, just as your presentation was tonight. Very interesting. One of the things that stood out to me about Dr. Wilmore is he was a tremendous communicator, very effective.
Right.
He had a way of calming voices. He had a way of making people hear what needed to be heard. And that's just a tremendous gift. And I'm sure God placed him in those particular positions because God wanted to use that gift that God had given Dr. Wilmore. It appears sometimes that he was a nice mixture right in the middle of perhaps Malcolm X and Martin Luther King. So I want to ask you, in your research, did Dr. Wilmore ever have any kind of contact, any conversations with Malcolm X? And as you said, he spent some time with Martin Luther King. How much time did he spend with Martin Luther King that perhaps either one of it would have been influenced by the other?
Thank you. And from your earlier, just absolutely agree about the communicator thing. A thought occurs to me as well that hasn't occurred to me before. If you think about spiritual gifts and people having different kind of gifts, is you could do something here with speaking in tongues and interpretation of tongues here. Somebody like Foreman speaks in tongues and you need somebody like Wilmore to interpret the tongues for you, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
I'm not a Pentecostal, but I appreciate that. Yeah, so I don't know about him meeting with Malcolm X. I wouldn't be surprised, but I have not seen that in the documents. I know he was aware of Malcolm X and was reading him, but that was more during the time when when Wilmore was a little more moderate in the early 60s. He met King, I think, only one time, which was the conference in Montreat in 1965, and he was a part of transporting King to and from the airport. And there was a whole deal about that because with the police escort, where they were trying to avoid any potential attacks or anything like that from the airport. And Dr. Wilmore just said he just had a conversation with King, and King just seemed really tired at that time and just seemed exhausted from all that he was doing. And that was just kind of his main observation, just kind of a personal, intimate kind of a thing. So not a lot of just kind of direct interaction, but clearly they were working and engaging in a lot of the similar kind of things, and he was trying to support these folks. But if other people know about particular connections, then I'd be happy to hear about them. So.
Thank you, Dr. Clark.
I believe Anita Moore Hackney had a question, but I didn't see her on my screen.
Yes, I wanted to say thank you so much for the lecture. I knew Gay, working with him at Black Presbyterians United, but I was particularly intrigued by your beginning when you shared with us how Gay became a Presbyterian. I thought that was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, yes. Yeah, I mean, it was a great migration. A lot of people were moving to the north and looking for new potential kinds of churches and things. But then there's this thing happen with all these white flight, and you've got all these churches. So that's right. Marvin Colombo Dandridge Wilmore pointed out there is a photo that shows Dr. Wilmore with Martin Luther King, and I think Coretta Scott King is in that photo as well, and I think Bayard Rustin as well. So I don't know the context for that photo, but so clearly they met. That was a different occasion. So they must have engaged more than at least twice.
One other thing, I just want to share this with those who are on the call. You mentioned that Dr. Wilmore's father was a Harlem hellfighter during World War I. Just want to share with you, there's a documentary that's being live streamed right now. I'm not quite sure because I live stream. I'm always surfing through all the live stream platforms. I'm not sure if it's Hulu or Tubi or what, but if you would go to search and put in Harlem Hellfighters, you'll find it. I have not watched it, but now that I know that Dr. Wilmore's father was part of that historic fighting group in World War I will definitely go back and I'll look at that documentary. Thank you.
And there's some things about Buffalo Soldiers in Italy as well that I haven't really looked into, but there's some films kind of stuff that relate to that I'd like to know more about that.
Next up, Jacques Swillmore.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm Jacques. I'm the second oldest son to my dad, Dr. Wilmore. I want to thank Dr. Clark and enjoyed reading his writings and hope, look forward to whatever else he may publish on that. I would just like to say that I have a copy of the novel that Dad wrote, and I've been telling myself I'm going to publish this, but the problem is he's got two versions of it. And I went through it with my father, and we tried to figure out, well, which one represented your last version of this novel. It's called Hoppergrass.
Yeah.
And he couldn't figure it out, and I did all kinds of statistical analysis, and I couldn't figure it out. But one day, I know Reverend Hamilton requested that, and I've been talking to my sister about publishing it. I'm not quite sure which version to publish or to publish both of them. And I'm not experienced about publishing, so I don't know. Maybe Dr. Clark can give me some advice about publishing a novel, because I don't know about that. Just a couple other things I'd like to say. Dad used to say that he knew Dr. King, but he avoided being seen with him in marches. He said a lot of the ministers wanted to be seen with him. He said he purposely avoided that. He took us to see Malcolm X. I remember the day he took the family to see Malcolm X speak. Whether he talked to Malcolm or not, I don't know.
Right.
A couple of things about his childhood, which he repeated many times to me, I'd like to mention. One is that he was encouraged by a school teacher that he could write. You can write, kid. And that encouraged him to enter into a contest, a writing contest, which he won. And he thought that was a milestone event in his life, where he won this award for writing an essay, and marched and got a subscription to the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia as a kid. He said he read as a kid. He liked to read a lot of philosophy, and somewhat of a nerd. I don't know. To appear to others to read philosophy, young Black man reading philosophy was just kind of weird. And the only other thing I'd like to say is that that activity in Lincoln University, I think my uncle also was involved in that. Yes. Uncle Jack.
Yes.
And that was also a significant time in his life. I miss my father. It's hard to believe he's been gone. What, 2018, I think it was. But I will do something about that novel. And those of you who are praying folks, pray that I have the wisdom to know what to do about it. And if somebody cuts corners and they want to wait for me and gets that novel from Dr. Clark, that's fine with me. I got to figure out which version represents, you know, his final version of that novel. It's pretty interesting. Thank you, Dr. Clark.
Thank you, Jack. And Jack and I have hung out a lot when I got to visit Dr. Wilmore. I would see Jack as well for that. But you know, so I do have a copy of the novel online.
Good.
I protect intellectual property, so
maybe we can consult with each other. What
Yeah.
you know, what can be done with that? Maybe you could help me because.
But I read it. I mean, I came across it pretty late in my dissertation process, and so it didn't make it into my dissertation writing.
Yeah.
When I changed and published the book, I would need to refer to it. So I haven't really written about the novel.
Yeah.
But it's a lot of it is largely autobiographical, with some tweaks, talking about the war and Lincoln University and this kind of stuff, and a lot of reflections about a question about going quote unquote back to Africa or not, right? And kind of deciding whether to do that. But it's called hopper grass, which refers to an African American kind of proverb about I think has to do with life being sweet in a lot of ways, but also having lots of challenges in it as well. And so yeah, I mean, it's a remarkable work, and I'd love to. I want to write some more about it and also see it sent out as well. So thanks, Jack. I think another thing you reminded me of with the thing about Martin Luther King and Malcolm X is Dr. Wilmore doesn't talk about himself a lot. He's a scholar. He writes about a whole lot of other people, and so it's kind of hard to find him in the story sometimes, because he's sort of being modest about it, and so it makes a little bit of work for us to figure out where he exactly was, because he's telling us about everybody else. So
Thank you.
There was a question in the chat from a while ago, and I do apologize that I missed it. So this message is for Carmen. Dr. Clark, thank you, Dr. Clark. What is the takeaway from this presentation? All respect due to Gayraud Wilmore and all those worked with him as activists, but where do we go from here? Your presentation delineated a historical perspective of Black theologian movement, but we have so much further to go.
Thanks. And that's a really broad question for a lot of folks. I think one of my takeaways is the continued vitality of the church and the Black prophetic tradition in terms of social justice and all the resources there. And also the fact here of the fact that, again, people with different kinds of gifts, different kinds of contributions can all contribute to things in the same ways. And thing I appreciate about things like the self-development of people, again, is that not every effort to move things forward has to be perfect. You know, we can all do different things in our different kind of areas of life to try to, work towards different kinds of justice. So, but a lot of other people should chime in, in some way about where do we go from here, right?
Looks like next with their hand raised, Mr. William Johnson.
Thank you. Dr. Clark, thank you so much for this presentation. I first met Dr. Wilmore during his tenure at Colgate Rochester Trojan Divinity School. And my agency hired a lot of students there, gave them internships or part-time jobs. But then he left Rochester and I lost track of him, and got reacquainted with him in a very interesting way. I was visiting a colleague at Inglewood who had retired from the National Urban League. And lo and behold, there were Dr. and Mrs. Wilmore living there.
Mm-hmm.
So that started about a 10-year, up to the end of his life. I actually talked to him about a week before he passed. 10-year, just great relationship. Got to know Jack very well. And I want to say two quick things. One, Jack will notice Dr. Wilmore told a story about the book. It may be that novel that he wrote when he was a graduate student, and he published it. And when he went to class, he proudly extolled this to the professor who was teaching the class, who said, "What? You've published a book? I've never published a book." And he said that put him in bad stead with that professor from that time forward. I'm sure he may have told you that story, Dr. Clark. And every time I visit Dr. Wilmore, I never turn my phone on to record that story, Jack, but you and I know.
Yeah, that wasn't the novel.
Story.
That wasn't the novel.
That wasn't a novel, but he did this.
That was another something
That was
he had
his
published.
But he said he learned it in his own career as a professor, you know. But anyway, here's a point I want to make to you. When you approached him, Dr. Clark, about your graduate studies and you wanted to do research, you know, here he was in his 90s and he was struggling. He wanted to write more. And then he said to me when I visited him one day, "This young fella, I don't know who he is, young white fella wants to come in and read my work and know about my work. And I don't know if I should let him in." He let you in. You published that paper. He read it before he died. He was so pleased. And what you have done, and what I've learned is this: in the civil rights movement, there are a lot of people. There are those who gravitate to the limelight. We know all about those people: the Kings, the Wilkins, the Vernon Jordans. We don't know about the Garrod Wilmores, those people who were laboring in the shadows, who were in the background, who were actually ensuring that those people in the limelight could get things done.
Yeah.
And Dr. Wilmore is not an obscure person.
No.
But you have brought him out of the shadows, Dr. Clark, and you have brought him so that young people, young scholars, young theologians will know about his work. So I just want to really appreciate the fact that you somehow discovered him and that you gave him really something to live for in the last few years of his life, because he looked so forward to your coming to visit, to bring your latest chapter, to talk to him. And I just wanted to have this opportunity to say that to your face. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It was such a blessing to get to know him. And really, I mean, there was so much information about him printed that I could have just done it without having to talk to him. But it was just so great to have that personal way and to be able to ask him about, so I read this thing, you know, tell me more about that. And it was wonderful that he was able to read or have it read to him before he passed. And so that was great. That first book, it was his first book, The Secular Relevance of the Church, was an ethics book that he proudly displayed to George Kelsey, who was his professor at Drew Theological Seminary, who was a very prominent scholar, African-American scholar at the time. But yeah, it was a good lesson for him there, I suppose. So yeah, I mean, he didn't finish his PhD program really because he got into all the civil rights stuff, you know, and he partly, you know, when you don't finish a program, you come up with why are the reasons this happened, but it's really because he had so much more important things to do than to stay in grad school for several more years.
Any other comments, questions? I don't see any more hands raised. And if you're raising your hand, your physical hand, I only see 20 screens on my side. So it's easier if you actually use the feature so I don't miss you. And thank you to my tech friends that are giving me the names of people that I did miss.
I do want to respond that there's one from Bernice Parker Jones about his disappointment about other Black scholars not cataloging his life and noting that his own students hadn't done that. And I just want to point out that it's a tremendous privilege to be able to basically full-time work on a dissertation for 3 or 4 years and have the time to do that and the resources to do that. And so he had a lot of students. A lot of them didn't have 3 years to sit there and work on a book like that. They had a lot of ministry to do and activism to do and work to do. And so a lot of people have carried forward his legacy in lots of other ways, many of them much more important than writing a biography. So just want to say that.
I would just like to remind everybody how deeply committed Gay was to BPU and to the fellowship here in the National Capital Presbytery. Bernice has been our moderator for before Shawnee and Dwight stepped in over some really exciting years. One of the exciting events that we did was a book study, a book review and discussion up at Howard University in Rankin's Chapel with James Cone, who came down from New York and did a presentation on his book, which had just been published, The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And kind of watching the two of them together was really a wonderful experience. I mean, the two of them just loved each other immensely and just fed off each other for years in their scholarship and in their activism. So he has been just such a tremendous gift to our local community and BPU, and he brought so much energy to everything we ever did, and we'll always remember him for that, amongst many other things.
I just really appreciate the support for my work and all the interest. I mean, I know it's support for Dr. Wilmore, but it's just great to be able to talk about this with people who really care and are really interested in his work and his mission.
Hello. Hello.
Hello?
Yes,
Yes, I'd just like to ask a question.
you can go. You can speak, Vanessa.
My question is, let me phrase it this way. Is it because the reason that the church kind of fell away from mass audiences and the attention to God, more to the fact that the state and the laws were constantly saying that the church and the state do not go together? Do you understand what I'm saying? So when there was a lot of activism, that was not toward God, but because of the laws that were being predicated by the government.
Right, activism, responding to the government and trying to change laws. And I'm not quite sure when there was the change that you're sort of referring to. So.
Well, for my period, I would say the Black Panthers.
Okay. So I mean, there were a lot of changes in terms of the federal government became much less kind of open to a lot of kinds of things, and the national mood among white people became much more hostile towards any kinds of changes. So that's a lot of what changed in the kind of late 60s, early 70s, right? I mean, you see this with the national politics as well. So.
And at that time, it was forbidden to have religious instructions in schools.
That's true. Yeah, that's true. Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah,
thank you for the
like,
presentation.
62, I think, was school prayer. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Brian, did you see the message from Daniel Acker asking
Yeah,
about?
yeah. I'll have to ask my colleagues here if they remember if that event at Howard had been recorded. I don't have that right on the top of my head, but we can find out if it is or not.
Well, I might have an answer to that. This is Eleanor Giddings Ivory. That was one of the books that we had a book review on, a book discussion on, when I was the chair of the BPU here locally. One of the things I did was organize twice a year book discussions and reads, and that was one of the major ones with James Cone and Dr. Wilmore, but I don't remember that we recorded it. It was at Howard. That was back in the prehistoric days before we started doing this kind of this recording stuff. If I may, I'll say if we're sharing things about Dr. Wilmore, and I'm sorry that I got on here late, I've been out, but I first met Gay when I was in Boston, in Cambridge, finishing up at Harvard Divinity School and becoming status applied pastor at Gloucester Memorial Presbyterian Church. And that was one of the places where he and Lee would come to worship. It was a bit intimidating to have PhD people in the congregation for me as a new pastor ordained in 1976, but they were very gracious, and there weren't many choices in the Boston area for Presbyterians. Only about 22 churches, Presbyterian churches in the whole of Presbyteria at that point, and only about 2,000 registered Presbyterians in the Boston area. So having Gay and Lee to be there was important. And I didn't run into Gay much again until we were both in the Washington, D.C. area, and he became very active in the local BPU here as I was coming in, retiring from my World Council of Churches job and becoming active here in the local BPU, and so did he. So he was instrumental in some of the reorganization of an activity of the BPU here. So I thought I would share that with you all. But Brian, no, I don't think that was recorded, but someone else may know.
You know, I got a feeling the university recorded it.
It might be that the university did, yes.
Because I remember there were lots of microphones around. There were people doing technical things in the background. But we can verify that. We'll check with the university.
Mm-hmm.
That was a long time ago now, after all.
Yes, it would have been about 2012 or so, 2012, 2013, something like that.
I want to say I put my personal email in the chat. It's douglas.brown.clark@gmail, and it's in there. If people have particular things they want to contact me about, I just want to make sure you have a way to do that.
So Dr. Clark, numerous people have asked if the recording of this session would be available. With your permission, could we share this with folk who weren't able to be here?
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
So, go ahead. Who's about to speak? So just, if you registered for this webinar tonight, I'll already have your email address. But if you did not register, you'll have to send me your email address. You can put it in the chat, or you can, you can put your email address in the chat. We have about 2 minutes. Any final questions, thoughts, comments?
Good night. Great presentation. Great presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank Dr. McLeod for helping me through the last days of my father's life.
Thank you, BPU and Brian, especially for coordinating.
Thank you. This has been wonderful. Thank you, Douglas. We sure do appreciate your commitment to Gay's life and work.
Thanks for having me. This has been really fun.
I would also thank Ali Latimer, who's probably present by phone on those difficult last couple of weeks of my father's life.
And Douglas, I want to thank you. I remember your visit. So you must have traveled quite a few miles to collect some personal stuff. But I also want to say I learned something from your presentation. I thought I knew Gay and his life fairly well. I did not know about the origin, the original use of the term Black theology, for one thing, but it doesn't surprise me. And I also did not remember his involvement in the Confession of 67. But I'm not surprised that he absent himself from that group after it wouldn't listen to some of the stuff that he was saying. That was a strange time in the land, so to speak. But one of the things a lot of people do not know is that Gay wrote one of the best theological essays, I guess I'd say, about the Black Manifesto. And it was written for the Presbyterian Church, but it's still a very relevant piece if anybody is reading the Black Manifesto today and they want to see how Gay Wilmore thought theologically about that. But thank you again.
Thank you. And that piece is what got me interested in this in the first place. I came across that in a class, his essay about the Black Manifesto, and it was like, man, this is interesting. Yeah. So that's what got me hooked.
Is that in print?
I mean, I got it through the library, through an interlibrary loan, I think. I think that's how I got it. I'm not sure that you can find it online. It's about maybe 18 pages or so.
Yeah, you could obtain it through the Presbyterian Historical Society.
Great. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's not impossible to find.
Do you recall the title off the top?
The Church's Response to the Black Manifesto from 1969.
Well,
and I should say James Cone is the one who's pointed out that he used the term Black theology first. My contribution was connecting that to the Confession of 67 piece. So but seeing those two together was something that I don't know anybody else who's made that connection yet.
So you did it well.
Yeah, but give James Cone credit for that part.
Douglas, you may have answered this question earlier, but has your thesis been published?
No, sir.
It hasn't. Is there any plan to seek to get it published?
Yeah, so it's my dissertation. It's about 500 pages or so, double spaced, and it's the plan is to revise it and publish it as a book. When I
cut down the number of pages, though.
Yes, well, that's the publisher will demand that for the sake of the readers. So you get some things down in the footnotes you can look at.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions or comments before we close? Well, once again, Dr. Clark, thank you so much for being with us this evening. And before that, thank you for the hard work that you've put in doing the research and the interviews and everything that you've done to make this evening one that is so memorable to us all. I feel like I kind of missed out that I did not get to meet Dr. Wilmore. I'm sure that if I had, I would have learned a lot from him. So thank you so much. And on behalf of BPU, as well as every other entity that's represented here tonight, we say thank you, and we're praying for you. We're praying for your dissertation and for whatever God has called you to do, as he has purposed you to be such a wonderful researcher and presenter to the people. So at this time, why don't we bow our heads? But before I do that, I just wanted to give Dr. Clark just another opportunity to share anything that he might want to say to us this evening. I know you've said a lot, but just one more opportunity.
I could go for another half hour about some other things, but no, no, you can read that in the book when it comes out. I just thanks for having me. Thanks everybody for your interest, and this has been really great. And again, my email is in the chat, and you can probably find it from somebody else if you need to, and I'd be happy to continue to talk to anybody about things. But thank you all, and thank you those of you who've been involved in a lot of these things that I talked about. Thank you for your different work and mission and ministry and your own path. So
yeah. Okay. Let us pray. Dear God, we're so thankful, God, for what you have allowed us to hear this evening. God, so much history is oftentimes shut away from us, or we just don't have access to it. But God, you allowed the history of a man who has worked so hard for so many years, and on behalf of humankind, on behalf of justice and righteousness, on behalf of the church. God, you have allowed us to hear his story and to be able to appreciate all that he has done to glorify you. God, we thank you for this informative, insightful, and inspiring presentation tonight that has been brought to us by Dr. Clark. In all of that, God, we saw your grace, not only your grace through the many years of Dr. Wilmore's work, but we saw your grace this evening as, Lord, we have come to relate with one another and to join hearts with one another and to know, God, that you are still in charge and you are present and you're still working in this world. So God, we thank you so much. We ask that you would bless Dr. Clark and all that you have purpose for him, that his dissertation will go forward, it will be successful, and that God, that you would just bless him, his family, and all that he endeavors to do. So God, continue to lift us up. Continue, God, to show us the way. Continue to inspire us. Continue, oh God, to pour out your blessings upon each and every one of us, each entity that we represent. And God, we will always lift you up as our sovereign God and give you the honor and the glory that you so deserves. Is this we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.
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 Thank you, everyone, for being a part of this wonderful presentation, and keep your eyes and your ears open and your email still active, because there is much more to come from BPU. So God bless you. Love you all, and look forward to seeing you the next time we gather, which will be in February for our BPU meeting. So you'll be getting emails about that. So God bless you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you,
Thank
Jesse.
you.
Thanks so
Thank
much
you.
for offering. This is
Thank you so
wonderful.
much. Bless you and thank you.